Today's story is a spooky story. The language in this story is a bit complicated. So after reading a few paragraphs of original text, you will hear this sound. And after this sound, I will read a B1 intermediate level version of the same text. And then you will hear this sound again, which means we are returning to the original. Any useful vocabulary words will be listed on the screen during the reading. They will also be listed in the description below, but I will not pause to explain them so that you can enjoy the story without interruptions. I asked chatgpt to simplify the words, so let me know what you think in the comments. Did it do a good job of translating the story into intermediate B1 level English? It looked pretty good to me. Let's find out as we hear the story of the third visitation. Here is the story. It was by the merest of chance that I found the book for a whole year ever since I returned to Malvern House. I had scrupulously avoided the library. Though a half-hour's work would have easily parted the sealed doors. But on this night of my 22nd birthday, the strange appeal which those closed doors had always exerted on me grew appallingly strong, and I jumped out of my sleepless bed and hastened downstairs as I passed the grandfather clock on the landing. I noticed it was a half hour after midnight. It was 1 a.m. when I parted the doors and stood upon the threshold. I hardly dared move inside. It was as if I were hearing again my father's stern words that after 11 years ago, when he caught me in the library. By chance, I found a book. For a year, I didn't go to the library at Malvern House. Even though I could have easily opened the doors, I avoided it. But on my 22nd birthday, I couldn't resist anymore and went to the library. It was after midnight when I got there, and I felt scared. I remembered my father's strict words from 11 years ago when he caught me in the library. "I don't know how you contrived to enter without a key," he cried, with his face white with anger. "But if ever again you enter this room, His lips trembled, his voice stammered with rage, and I, puny tyke of 10 that I was, squirmed out of his grasp and fled, never hearing the end of his sentence. I never heard him speak again, for that matter. For that night, at his desk in the library, he suddenly passed away, his hands clutching at his throat. I never really knew my father. We had never been companions or pals, or whatever boys and their fathers are supposed to be. I remember him vaguely as a lonely, austere man, tall, serious of countenance, and surprisingly for a man of only 40, with a shock of pure snow-white hair. His pictures show him black-haired, and that's how I think I remember him. But I'm certain, on that particular day, when he grabbed me so fiercely, that his hair was snow-white. One time when I was 10, I went into the room without a key, and my father got very angry. He yelled at me, and he said, if I ever did it again, something bad would happen. I ran away, and never heard him speak again, because he suddenly died that night while sitting at his desk in the library. I didn't really know my father well. We weren't close. I remember him as a serious, tall man with pure white hair. even though his pictures show him with black hair. The books in the library, so the story went, were, according to the instructions in his will, supposed to be burned. But the executors, evidently thinking it a sick man's phobia, circumvented the order and compromised by sealing the library. The house, too, was closed, while, until I was 21, I went to live with my aunt, my mother's sister. My mother had died when I was 2, and my aunt had long wanted me to live with her, insisting, or so I heard, that my father was too preoccupied to bring up a child. And now I was in the library from which I so fearfully routed, the library in which my father had so suddenly died. It was no different from 1,000 other libraries. High ceiling, oak brown, with tiers of books that lined the walls from baseboard to the rafters. People tell me that according to his will, my father wanted his books to be burned. But the people in charge of his will didn't do it, and instead closed the library. After my mother died when I was 2, I went to live with my aunt until I turned 21. My aunt wanted me to live with her because she thought my father was too busy to take care of me. And now I was in that library, the same one where I was scared and where my father died suddenly. It looked like any other library with high ceilings and brown walls and a lot of books. I had not browsed long among them when I noticed a shocking thing. The books, written in many languages, dealt almost exclusively with mysteries of the occult, with mesmerism, and visitations, and alchemy, and ancient and medieval magic. I'm using the pages as some 6 volumes, wondering what my father had to do with these strange studies, and then, putting away a book, I came across the diary of my father. The entries were in a neat, meticulous hand, but now and again there were passages in which the lengthening, uneven strokes showed a high pitch of excitement, which was surprising because my father was a most controlled man. And as I read, a deep uneasiness seized me, and I was tempted 12 times to hurl the diary away, to burn it, to destroy the whole library. But I was powerless to act, and chilled and fearful, and I found I could not stop reading. All of the pages were filled with notes on the experiments, desperate, futile experiments that my father had carried on to bring back my mother, my father's wife, who had died so early and so young. As I looked through the books in the library, I noticed something strange. Most of the books were about things like magic, alchemy, and other mysterious things. I wondered why my father was interested in these things. Then I found my father's diary, which was written in a neat and careful way, but sometimes the writing was shaky and showed that my father was very excited about something. This was surprising because my father was usually very calm. As I read the diary, I felt scared and I wanted to stop reading it, but I couldn't. The diary was all about my father's desperate and unsuccessful attempts to bring back my mother, who had died when she was very young. And then on page 74, as the first fingers of dawn were poking through the window, I found the excited, scrawled words, At last, I have it, I have it. And immediately my fingers trembling, my blood suddenly ice, I snapped the book shut. But not before I saw the next paragraph was written in Latin. Shaken, I returned the diary to its place, vowing never to open it again, and hurried upstairs praying for restful sleep. But I slept fitfully and was up at noon, and though I dutifully averted my eyes from the library all day, when darkness closed in, I found I could fight off the call of the library no longer. I found the diary, opened it to the right page, and slowly spelled out the Latin phrases my father had so laboriously entered. One day I found my father's diary in the library. Most of the books in the library were about occult mysteries, and my father seemed to be interested in them. I read the diary and found out that my father had been conducting desperate experiments to bring back my mother, who had died when I was very young. On page 74, I saw that my father had written excitedly that he finally had found something. The next paragraph was in Latin, and I felt scared and closed the book quickly. I promised myself not to open the diary again, but I couldn't resist the library's call. When I opened the diary again, I found the page with the Latin phrases and started reading them slowly. I cannot say I willed what I did next, nor can I say that I did not will it, but the translated words before me. I went through the steps one by one of my father's painstaking experiment. I drew in white chalk the circle, and within the pentagram I turned off the lights, and in each corner of the pentagram I placed a candle in a drawer of the desk I found untouched these many years. 2 envelopes with Latin inscriptions, and from it I sprinkled a little white powder in the appropriate spots on the pentagram. It was now well past 2 a.m. Upon the stroke of 3, as it stated in the diary, the candles flickering, the chalk marks glowing, and the yellow ghost light, I intoned the words underscored in the Latin text. And when I sat back and waited, the candles burned garishly. I could hear the sighing wind outside, and then I heard a soft, faint whisper. A whisper that was like the rustling of the finest silk, and a soft wisp, like the faintest of smoke signals, appeared in the center of the pentagram, like a chrysalis emerging. A figure, gentle and soft, as seen through a cloud, stood before me. In life, I had not known her, but I had seen pictures often. The lady before me was my mother. My father's experiment had worked. I don't know if I wanted to do what I did next or not, but I followed my father's instructions. I drew a circle and I put the candles in the corners. I found 2 envelopes with Latin writing in a desk drawer and sprinkled some powder in the circle. It was after 2 a.m. in the morning. At exactly 3 o'clock, I said the words in the Latin text and waited. The candles burned, and I heard a soft whisper. A figure appeared in the middle of the circle, like a butterfly emerging from a cocoon. It was my mother, whom I had never met, but had seen in pictures. My father's experiment had worked. I cried to her. I would have her talk, but she stood just so, unmoving, wordless, beautiful, and real. And just as I thought she was about to speak, the film wafted about her, and she was gone. And the candles flickered out, and I said in the darkness, remembering the text, said the visitation lasted but a minute. I don't know how I found my room or my bed, or how I lived through the next day, but when night closed in again, I hurried to the library. This time, I went through the diary more carefully. Many, many pages later, I encountered another paragraph in Latin. This was more complex. This was a more complex experiment. And the visitation, I noted, lasted for 5 minutes. Though the incantation and the steps leading to the evocation of the figure were more complicated than the first coming, I set about it with mingled eagerness and apprehension. By 3 a.m., all was in readiness. The candles flickered. The chalk marks glowed airily. Suspended from the ceiling was a canine tooth, found in another envelope in the desk, and a strange smelling powder burned with acid odor. And after the incantation, I waited. Again, the figure of my mother appeared. This time, I knew she would talk. But after 5 minutes, said the notes, she would be gone, and the rest was broken off in a frenzied scroll. I could not decipher what, I wonder, had happened, but my imagination could not even surmise. The notes, as I said, had indicated that she had talked, but minutes passed and there was no sound. She merely stood, smiling, in all her real but wispy loveliness. She must have known I was her son, for after a while, she held out her arms as if summoning me. And then, just as I was about to give up hope of hearing her speak, I saw her lips move, and I heard words. But I did not know what she said, for with her first words, an incredible and impossible transformation began to take place. Her features, how shall I say it, crawled like the earth in a landslide. The flesh began to disintegrate, and it was as if I were seeing, in a fast action film, the process of decay over many years. At 3 a.m., everything was ready. The candles were flickering. The chalk marks glowed strangely. There was a tooth hanging from the ceiling, and some smelly powder burned. After reciting the incantation, I waited. Suddenly, my mother appeared again, and this time I knew she would talk. But after 5 minutes, she was supposed to disappear, and I couldn't understand the notes that followed. She stood there smiling, and eventually she held out her arms as if to embrace me. And just as I was about to give up hope, she started speaking. But I couldn't understand what she was saying. And then something impossible happened. Her features started to decay rapidly. I don't know if I screamed, if I cried out. I think I was powerless to move, to utter a sound. I could not take my eyes away, and yet I could not bear to see further. And then, as if in answer to my prayers, the 5 minutes were up, and the vision was gone. Enough, I told myself, was enough. But the devil himself must have prompted me, for the next night, in the library again, poring over the third Latin entry, the last, it was the night of the third visitation that my father had died. Would I die too? And then I saw the words that could terminate a visitation. They had not worked for my father, I reasoned, or had he indeed invoked them? With trepidation, I carried through the experiment. At the stroke of 3, I began the invocation. My words trembled. I sat fearfully as my words died away. The wisp of film appeared, and presently my mother materialized before me, as lovely, as beautiful, as alive as she must have been in life. And this time, I knew she would stay as long as I wished, as long as life itself. The metamorphosis of the previous night, I concluded, must have been my imagination. I was scared. I saw my mother's face again. I couldn't move or speak. I wanted the vision to end, and it did after 5 minutes. But the next night, I went back to the library to read the last Latin entry. My father had died after the third visitation, and I was scared I might die too. But I found the words that could end the visitation. I did the experiment, and my mother appeared again. This time, I knew she would stay as long as I wanted. I realized the transformation I saw before was just my imagination. She stood thus, smiling, silent, and beautiful, and when the first 5 minutes were almost up, she began to speak. But with her first words, a terrible chill seized me, for again the disintegration of flesh was taking place. The bloom was gone from her cheeks, the flesh began to wither, and from her shoulders and arms the visible life was oozing away. Her garments no longer became her. They began to hang like a shroud. As soon as she continued talking, the first faint lineaments of her skeletal contour showed itself. This, I knew, was what my father had seen. This was what was to be with me forever. And still, the disintegration continued. I don't know how I found my voice, but suddenly it tore from me, shrill, horror-filled, with words that my father had penned. Filia mortuorum vade ad tue tumbe. When I woke up, I was alone in the room, and all the chalk marks were gone, and all else. And as I passed the mirror to hurl the diary into the fireplace, I saw with a shock of horror that my hair, like my father's, had suddenly become snow white. She stood there, not saying anything, but looking beautiful and smiling, and when the first 5 minutes were almost over, she started to speak. But when she spoke, something terrible happened. Her body started to decay. Her clothes didn't fit her anymore, and I realized this is what my father had seen when he did the same experiment. The decay continued until I couldn't bear it anymore. I screamed the words my father had written to stop the visitation, and then I passed out. When I woke up, everything was gone, and my hair had turned snow white just like my father's. It was a shocking experience. Uh-oh, what do you think happened to him? Do you think that he died just like his father because his hair turned snow white? Well, that was the story of the third visitation. What do you think of this B1 intermediate level translation using chatgpt? Did it do a good job? Did you understand pretty well? Was it easy to understand? Leave a comment and let me know.